Hello everyone, welcome to this public lecture on game design with myself, Luke Haslett. So in today's session we are going to be talking about how to approach puzzles and give a little introduction into how we start thinking about them in terms of design, the different types of puzzles that are out there that we can start to understand where we can build from, especially things like basic principles and the considerations we have to think about with the player's knowledge in terms of the game we are designing. Then we can move on to thinking about how to set some gameplay objectives for players and how to organise our hierarchy of puzzles and the structure they would fit into. Then we'll talk a little bit about how we practice puzzle design using that theory we've just gone over, mainly with frameworks. So we have some frameworks that already exist out there for games. We talk about how we teach with those, as well as then moving on to explaining that we use frameworks that we've built ourselves within staffs. Then I'll round things off with how you can use all this information to use in your applications for university. So first of all, a little bit about me. That's a picture of me from a few years ago where I had shorter hair and not this bun sitting on top of my head. Who am I? So I am a games design lecturer at Staffs Uni. I've been teaching here for 6 years now. I'm a module leader for several modules to do with pre-production design, narrative in games, and rapid game design itself. And those are taught across different levels at university in our game design programs. I've also taught extensively on other modules to do with user interfaces or user experience, and analog game modules, things like board games and escape rooms. I'm also a researcher in narrative design. So I am working on a PhD at the moment that is focusing on how we measure player experiences using natural language interaction, which is becoming more of the conversation as we move forward. And what is this public lecture for? So it's to provide an insight into what we kind of teach at Staffs, and it's specifically for anyone that's interested in understanding fundamentals of game design. And why is that important? Well, it's because you might be interested in game design or games development in general, but might not know where to begin. Okay, so that's where we're going to get into some of the basics that we start thinking about in our teaching. Starting off with how we approach puzzles. So why are puzzles important to games? So puzzles, in general, they provide a unique challenge. This requires players to think in new and very creative ways to solve them, offering something different from combat to exploration challenges and things like that. They add lots of depth and variety to gameplay. This breaks up the monotony of gameplay actions with different types of challenges, so you can always be expecting the player to do different things at different times, and that helps them feel more engaged and interested in the game as they're playing it. And this also can create a sense of achievement for them. Solving puzzles that are difficult can provide lots of feelings of accomplishment in the player, which is a really powerful motivator for them to continue playing forward in the game you've designed for them. And it can also be integrated into the narrative, so often it is used to enhance gameplay narrative because the players have to solve puzzles, and then that allows them to progress narrative storylines. But also puzzles can be educational, in the sense that we are always teaching the players new skills and new concepts that they then have to take forward and further into the game in order to explore more of it and progress. Now, game mechanics should always be able to support puzzles. Okay, puzzles are mechanisms that form part of most games. There are many types, and they mostly all require one thing, and that's to make the players stop and think about their actions before they can move forward. Now, traditionally, puzzles are very rule-based systems, just like video games, but the goal is always to find a solution, not just beat an opponent, because that's normally quite determinate, and that in itself can afford very little replayability value. For example, when you complete a jigsaw puzzle, you don't normally break it apart and then immediately do it again and again and again. So in modern games, puzzles in those will need to lean on what makes them more enjoyable. Okay, so there's a couple things here that we can keep in mind that helps puzzles feeling more fun. That's their novelty and their challenge. When it comes to novelty, puzzles are a form of play, and when we play, we are suspending the whole idea of the rules of daily life that we go through, and when we're playing, that gives us permission to actually do things that are quite impractical. So, puzzles that take something familiar, giving it a novel twist in a good way, that becomes inviting to players to then be in that state of playfulness. Then we also have the challenge aspect. If puzzles are too easy, they are disappointing, but also vice versa, if they're too difficult, it makes the game quite discouraging. So we always need to keep players in a state of flow and always offer hints when they're needed. And one thing that we have to think about when it comes to puzzle design is playtesting is the most important factor to be able to understand that our puzzles are suitable for the needs of the player at that time. But what examples can we see in modern video games themselves? So, anything pretty much can be a puzzle. Sometimes they're quite visible, things like spatial puzzles, environmental ones, or physics-based ones. When it comes to spatial puzzles, we can think about manipulating objects in a play space, much like how Tomb Raider games require the players to move objects around the room into specific places, and that might unlock a door that opens. When it comes to environmental puzzles, this is more about influencing the world in one place from another. We see in a lot of Metroidvania games, but also Prince of Persia is a good example because it requires players to control time and move through time to find a resolution that way. And then you have the physics-based puzzles, understanding what the physical principles are in the game rules, such as Portal, where the players have to create teleports across different rooms and platforms, and they navigate the space that way. But also sometimes puzzles are mini-games, so they could be logical, like in The Witness, where players draw lines from one point to another, and it requires deduction to decipher the patterns of how exactly the players are drawing that line from A to B, because it's not always going to be in the same pattern. However, it always is going to be just a line from A to B. Also, minigames can be arcade styles, and this is always representing a game from a previous era of video games. We saw this in the BioShock game, where you would have an old arcade game called Pipelines that was then represented as a minigame within BioShock. Also, puzzles can hide in gameplay. Now, these create more depth and challenge as a result for that game, and it makes the game much more engaging. Combat, for example. This is often where players are required to learn patterns and strengths of their enemies, and then they can overcome them and use weapons and abilities effectively to beat the combat challenge. Pokemon is very well known for this. It has a rock, paper, scissors approach where you would see what Pokemon the opponent is playing, maybe a fire type, and then you would decipher that, yep, I will need to use a water type because that is stronger than their fire type. Stealth is also a type of puzzle that hides in gameplay. You use mechanics like cover, distractions, and techniques that kind of keep you remaining undetected, and these are all part of that stealth puzzle. Hitman games are very good at utilising this as its core gameplay experience. Resource management is another thing we can think about, where we are managing resources in survival or progression loops, normally in the form of things like keeping on top of our characters' food levels, their water levels, what resistances they might have to the elements in the scene they're in, ammunition they carry, the mana they have to cast spells, all of these kind of things. In some scenarios like the Metro games, ammo is currency, and that facilitates an even more complex version of a puzzle because it's a risk-reward structure. The player has to think about if they have enough ammo to be able to move forward in the game, or do they want to use that currency to then get something else that helps them move forward. Timing is another idea, so we use reaction skills to navigate levels and overcome enemies. Most roguelikes have this as part of its core formula, like Hades. Bullet hells, you have to dodge out of the way of the enemy attacks before you can overcome them and move forward past that puzzle. And basic principles. So we as designers need to make the goals very easy to understand for players. To get the players interested in your puzzle, they have to know what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, they are just going to lose interest almost immediately and quit your game. Puzzles can rely on the fun being based on figuring out what to do. That's one of the approaches you have to be careful with and have some caution. Generally, only die-hard puzzle enthusiasts enjoy the a whole challenge of figuring it out what it is they're supposed to do. This is an example here of an old game called Nemesis Factor. It was a quite ingenious puzzle game, revered very much by puzzle fanatics because it was very creative, very interesting, and very challenging. Okay, it presented 100 puzzles that gradually increase in difficulty as you go through them, and it was all thought about and reviewed as the next Rubik's Cube. Okay, we can see there on the screen that it just comes as this box that pretty much is a few steps going up the box, and those little steps light up. However, this game Nemesis Factor violated what we know as the first rule of puzzles, and that is making a clear goal for the player. With this game, it was very difficult to guess what the goal was, and that was the point. It's even difficult to guess how to interact with the game itself, because you buy the game, but the game then tells you very little about what you do with it. Okay, and then there's 100 puzzles that have different goals. So generally, audiences found it really frustrating because it's an open-ended problem that gives very little feedback to tell you whether or not you as a player are on the right track. So you would complete one puzzle, and then the next puzzle is a completely different set of rules, and you've got to figure it out. So yeah, making goals easily understood is really important. Another basic principle we should think about in design is a sense of progress. Now, players should be able to see the answer emerging as they attempt to complete the puzzle. They want to feel themselves getting closer to that solution, especially when they're frequently manipulating elements of a puzzle in real time, because it gives them the hope that they're actually going to arrive at that puzzle. And that is why the Rubik's Cube itself was so popular. Okay, players will persistently try to solve a Rubik's Cube. If you see one, you pick it up, you give it a go, you spin it a few rows or columns a few times, see how you get on. Maybe you progress, you keep playing, or you don't understand what you're doing, you put it down. But we always pick one up, and we always give it a go. And that's because we can see and feel a sense of progression as we're playing with it. And gradually, novice players will start to add more colours to one side of the cube. Then suddenly they have an entire side completed, and then once they've got one side done, they only have 5 more to resolve, which is easier said than done, but it's a very clear sense of progression. You see the grid on each side starting to come together. Another basic principle is a sense of solvability. It's very much related to that sense of progress we just talked about. If players suspect the puzzle itself is unsolvable, they're just going to feel hopeless. If they feel hopeless, they will then give up. They feel like they're wasting their time. So it's your job as a designer to convince the players that the puzzle is solvable. Okay, visible progress is a really good way of doing this, but so is just stating that, hey player, the puzzle actually does have an answer. When we think about the Rubik's Cube, it does a really great job at this. When we think about the Rubik's Cube, it does a really great job of this. When it's purchased, it's already solved. It's in that solved state. All the sides have all the colours on each side. That's when the player gets hold of it, they twist it up, they jumble up the colours, and then it's a mess. But, in theory, the solution is the same process in reverse. We just have to unjumble the colours. Obviously it takes many more twists than that, but it doesn't really matter how frustrated the player gets with the cube. And that's because there was never any doubt that the puzzle can be solved, because that's how it was presented to the player. So now we know a little bit about those puzzle basic principles, we can then start to think about more the considerations of the player's knowledge base. So when we're designing puzzles, it's really important to consider 2 camps that puzzles will fall into. That puzzles require a prior knowledge, or that puzzles require introducing a new material. Now if we understand that, it helps us understand the purpose behind our design. So let's explain those a little bit. The puzzles with no prior knowledge required. In this category, the players are not expected to understand key mechanics or the concepts just yet. The goal of these is to introduce entirely new processes and skills that they will then take forward in overcoming challenges. By presenting players with new gameplay possibilities, these are the puzzles that help the player build their vocabulary of gameplay mechanics in the game you've created, and helps foster the development of the player's critical thinking skills. Ideally, these puzzles should centre around the learning of new knowledge rather than relying on the application of prior knowledge. It helps provide opportunities for the player to acquire and grasp key mechanics and concepts, and then they are fully prepared to use them to move forward for the future challenges in the game. Then we have puzzles that require prior knowledge. These rely on what the player has already learned, how they already understand the mechanics and concepts, and at this point, going into a puzzle like this, the player should already possess the necessary knowledge to attempt to find a solution in this type of puzzle. They don't need extensive teaching or any guidance on how to complete it. They are already equipped with the kind of knowledge they need to progress. The goals of these kinds of puzzles include testing the player's current understanding of how the game works and pushing those limitations. They can also be applying previously learned knowledge to gain deeper understanding of mechanical interactions. So they might have already attempted a puzzle like this, but then we are using this mechanic again in a more diverse or deeper way. So then that helps them understand the different ways they can use this mechanic. Also allows the player to practice skills and processes that they have previously learned, keeping on top of their knowledge base so that they can always be familiar with what they have. And it also is, again, developing their critical thinking skills. Now, ideally, these puzzles should focus on the application of prior knowledge and always encourage reflection on that knowledge. Okay, they should not introduce significant amounts of new material, or these kind of puzzles shouldn't require extensive learning. So that's a little bit about the player knowledge considerations. Some key takeaways to think about those two camps. Always understand the role of puzzles that introduce new materials that are set on foundations. This allows us to explore puzzles that require the prior knowledge. And it's really important to strike a balance between puzzles that require prior knowledge and those that introduce new materials. If we incorporate both of these types of puzzles in game design, we can then create a well-rounded learning experience. And this is what keeps players engaged as they acquire new skills and helps them deepen their understanding of the game. The combination of both puzzle types creates this dynamic learning curve. It provides opportunities for players to learn, apply, and then master the game mechanics. And a balanced approach like this will enhance engagement and promote a more rewarding player experience as a whole. So let's think about how we then set the gameplay objectives. Because now we know what we're designing for, so we can now create what that experience for the player is going to be. And just like any other gameplay, we start by considering what the objectives are of that player's experience. And you can think of this with a general aim for each puzzle, and these aims can explain why you're creating puzzles. 3 simple questions: what is the player doing, how are they going to do it, and why does the player do it? Now these questions need to be asked for every rule, object, every tool that you're giving players in your game. The order that you introduce puzzles and their mechanics is really crucial to that developmental process. Some games have an open-ended structure in open world scenarios that allows them to solve puzzles in any order, so that's why you have to be able to understand these 3 answers. And also the dangers of having that open world structure, you have to understand those answers for this, because we are challenging players with new concepts, and if it's an open world structure, they might not have been onboarded for those concepts just yet. So that's where understanding their knowledge considerations comes in. Once you have an aim, it gets more detailed. Your gameplay objectives are details of what the players should have achieved after each puzzle they've completed. They should be written in a way that can be readily measured if they have completed it correctly. For example, instead of a general statement like players should use symbols to unlock the box, you could say players should use a translation book to be able to identify 5 symbols from a list to unlock the box. Now that first statement we just saw is really hard to measure and it's quite vague. Whereas that second statement, well, it identifies those three questions: the what, the how, and the why. The what is all about the player uses a translation book. How? Well, they are identifying 5 symbols from a list. And the why is they're just unlocking the box. One way to think about gameplay objectives is to use a SMART methodology. Might be something we've all heard before, but a quick Google will be able to find a little bit more depth on this. It's just making sure that all of your objectives are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time focused. Now, once you have your gameplay objectives set, it's really good practice to consider the player's mastery. Some objectives will be something for everyone, that everyone should be able to do. Then there could be some objectives that are trickier, that most players will be able to accomplish. Then you could have stretch goals in there that very few players will be able to achieve. Next, read back over your objectives and think about how you could make them easier or harder. Now, depending on how dynamic your puzzle is, players could opt for an easy or hard approach to the puzzle. And if you can adjust this difficulty, that means you may be able to rearrange the puzzles in a different order in case there are issues later on with pacing. Also, remember to use appropriate hints and clues that relieve any player frustration they may have as they try to solve the puzzle. It's all dependent on the level of difficulty of the puzzle itself, but it is important to think about a positive player experience. Now we can move on to how we organise the puzzles. Now, there are multiple ways of organising them, and in reality many experiences will be a kind of hybrid mixture, but personally you may lean towards some more than the others. One example is a linear puzzle structure. It's one of the simplest, where just one puzzle is discovered and must be solved one at a time. With each puzzle solution, they lead into the next puzzle in the sequence. It's a very tried and tested technique, however it can be difficult to scale up without issues in pacing. Then we have non-linear puzzles, much more an open structure, where all the puzzles are available to work on at the same time, and it culminates in a final puzzle at the end of the experience, which depends on all the prior puzzles before it being solved before you can get to the end. It could be hard for players to work out what to do next with this, or which clue is for which problem, and it does, however, have a good potential of being able to scale up with pacing, especially with different players maybe working on different puzzles at the same time until the end, if it's a multiplayer style of the game. Then we have the branching paths approach, where it is a cross between the first two puzzle types of linear and non-linear. This gives multiple pathways which each leads to a puzzle at the end. It does have the potential for a richer scaling experience and gives players lots of different approaches, also increases replayability value, and you could construct each path to include the same gameplay objectives and then just bring them together at the end. And as I mentioned, the hybrid approach is the most common. Simply, it's just a mix of all those other different approaches. And it's far more likely that you're going to be using this kind of structure. You may start with a linear sequence and then it will split off into multiple pathways, that kind of thing. There's no right or wrong way to organise your puzzles, just do what makes sense to you, especially when you consider the difficulty within the activities of the puzzles. Always make sure that whatever structure you end up with, the players just aren't getting lost. Being unsure of where to go is a really quick way for the players to be pulled out of the immersion of the game and feel disengaged. Then when moving on to create your puzzles, it can often be easier to look at what the final objective is for the puzzles. This will give you a clue on your destination, and a lot of designers like to design backwards from there. Then finally, if you start sketching out your structure as you're building it, it will give you a rough idea of how the pace should go. Okay, this will likely change as you organise your challenges and build more, and you can use flowchart software like draw.io or diagrams.net, etc. Or Word itself has this functionality built in for flowchart creation, and you can use this to basically move things around and get a good grip of what your pacing is going to be. So now we've covered the basics in how we approach designing puzzles, that the next logical step is to then practice these skills. And one way that we like to do this at Staffs is by using a little thing called a framework. Now there's lots of benefits that come with frameworks, and we use them because they are great tools for actually just getting straight into and designing and exercising our skills. Frameworks often streamline the development process for us because a lot of the hard technical graft has already been done, which means we haven't got to waste time just coding. We can then just focus on being creative with the experiences that we design and then seeing the result in people playing it. Developing with these kind of tools also helps with transferable skills. This is enabled via rapid prototyping and iterative techniques, as well as it's improving your general problem solving abilities for when it comes to then building in lots of different frameworks. You can't just carry the knowledge across of how the approaches are. And there are often lots of communities built around pre-existing frameworks, so that helps with providing more layers of support and creating more avenues for you to get feedback on your designs. So here are some of the most commonly used frameworks that we see. Games like Super Mario Maker 2 come with the actual editor built into the game. So when you open it up, you have the option of utilizing the creation tools to start creating your own 2D environmental spaces. Then we have something like Portal 2, which does the same thing. You buy the game and then you get the editor tools built in, and this is for more 3D environmental puzzles. Unreal Editor for Fortnite, so it uses the Unreal Engine toolkit to actually then create and publish works in Fortnite. Then there's the Warcraft 3 editor, which was a massively popular editor when it came to real-time strategy games, but people got really creative with it. We actually saw several genres like MOBAs and tower defenses and all these kind of things, all born out of the editor itself. The Hammer engine is another popular Valve editor used for games like Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, Half-Life, those kind of things. And then even games like Age of Empires 4 has fairly recently, at the time of this recording, released the content editor to create your own kind of scenarios within the game. So these are very popular framework editors that we see, and we use a few of those at Staffs. Now, working with frameworks for puzzle design, I personally like to teach with the Portal 2 editor. It works really well as an introductory tool for newer students because Portal is a game all about puzzle design. It has a very highly streamlined editor built in, so much so that you can just build the playable level within minutes of getting into it. Then as a user, you can literally play your creations in seconds. The editor will build the level that you've designed immediately to whatever the blueprint specs are that you've designed and run it live in that game's engine. So you can just jump straight in, and if there's any issues you can jump out of it, change a few things, and then jump back into it. The editor itself is really easy, very quick to learn. It comes built with a selection of prefabricated items that you can use, and you can add lots of depth to how those items are used with each other. It's really accessible, there's no coding required, and it simply is a case of just pulling the elements into the scene and then connecting them. Then we also have our own frameworks that we've built at Staffs Uni. So we also teach using our own technical frameworks, often built in common engines like Unreal Engine or Unity, and these are often built also with students as part of our own internal game development internship programs. So it gets students to have a little bit more hands-on experience. There are several benefits to why we also use our own frameworks. It's because they provide a tailored learning experience which allows us to align them much more with the curriculum as well as our specific teaching goals or learning objectives. This allows customization for us as lecturers to the specific needs of the students, and it's also excellent for students to develop strong foundations in using frameworks as they move forward to more complex frameworks or engines. Also helps create a deeper understanding of mechanics, so students are more focused on just the underlying principles of the designs, and it empowers them to grasp the fundamental concepts moving forward. And of course, transferable skills, so things like critical thinking, problem solving, and it's wider applicable in design to other spaces. This creates much more manageable steps for the students so that they can actually work towards getting into the engines themselves. And with that, we now have an understanding of basic theory and how we can then start utilizing that theory in practice-based scenarios. It's now time to think about how we approach university. So where is this type of content taught in our curriculum? So we recognize the importance of teaching game engines alongside our own frameworks. We have a number of game design courses to facilitate this kind of learning. The first one is a gameplay design and production course, which focuses on experimental game design and taking ideas from concepts all the way through to playable prototypes. We also have the computer games design course itself, which offers lots of different tracks for game design, which include 3D art and animation. And you can use the kind of stuff we've gone over today to help build your application portfolios. So if you think that game design is the career for you and you'd like the kind of stuff you've seen today, you can use these QR codes on screen there, or go straight to our website to find more information about those two courses, as well as the other courses that we offer. With that, you should start experimenting with tools like the Portal 2 editor and pretty much anything else you can get your hands on. This lecture will give you a starting point on how to approach your puzzles. You can play around, build things, and we'd love to see your passion actually presented in your applications. So if you have some kind of portfolio website as part of your application process, just include links that show videos of this kind of stuff you've been working on, and we'd love to see it. And with that, if you have any questions about today's topics or game design at Staffs, feel free to email me at luke.haslett@staffs.ac.uk. As well as that, I'm on Twitter at Not a Marvel Hero. You can find my academic ramblings about games design on there, but you can also find our department at Staffs Games Dev on Twitter as well. We post lots of things that we get up to, away days, taking the students to museums, these kind of things, as well as the student work and the things that we get up to as Staffs. Okay, with that, thank you very much for joining me today, and take care.